Well, thank you very much indeed for having me here. My name is Callum Williams. I am a senior economics writer at The Economist based in San Francisco. I write on a wide range of different things, the housing market, labor markets, and globalization. And sometimes I write about the UK as well, although being in the States, my view tends to be somewhat wider. But what we've been seeing over the past few months really is that there's been big changes in the way that the global economy is structured, and that is going to have big impacts, I think, on the UK economy. A lot of sort of nasty things have happened in the past few years, from the pandemic to inflation to war, and I think a lot of the kind of the narrative about the UK economy and indeed about the economy in general, the global economy, is quite negative. I think there's reason to be optimistic. I think cautiously optimistic, and I'm going to explain why that is. Um, my presentation really is going to be just me talking, and it's going to be in two parts. The first part is really going to be about globalization and how it's changing, and then the second part is going to be about what that means for the UK economy. So let's look first at what's been happening to globalization. Really, you can think of it in terms of kind of three phases. The first phase is the one that took place after the Second World War, so the kind of post-war period. And during this period, globalization was kind of in retreat in many ways. That trade barriers were pretty high. Governments played a pretty important role in managing economic activity and managing the private sector. And sort of investment and capital flows between different countries were actually fairly low during this period. So that's kind of phase one. Phase two is the phase that we're now leaving. That phase started really in the 1990s and really got going in the 2000s when globalization truly took off. And you saw this in a variety of different ways. One was the collapse of tariffs, really. Tariffs kind of, in a sense, stopped existing for most goods, and that helped global trade to really take off. And the other thing that happened was that immigration took off in a very serious way, and also capital flows increased very, very seriously too. So during this period, it was kind of possible to imagine that, we were moving from a situation where you have lots of different national markets to a situation where you had one globally integrated market, one globally integrated trading market, one globally integrated financial market. And you could see this very clearly in the data. Global trade flows were rising year on year. One other interesting measure I think it's kind of good to look at is the price of a given commodity or item or service, such as a glass or bottles or indeed hairdressing. The prices of those services were converging across different countries. So in other words, if a chair cost $10 in the US, then it was increasingly likely that it would cost $10 in the UK, in France, and even in Ethiopia or in China. So what, in other words, was happening is that markets were becoming increasingly integrated. Now we're moving into the third phase. And the third phase, contrary to what you may be reading in some media outlets, does not mean the end of globalization. Globalization is absolutely not coming to an end, but I think it is slowing down, and you can see this. You can see this very clearly. You can see this in the trade data, where trade has kind of peaked. You can see it in the financial data, where capital flows between different countries have not just peaked, but have come down a long way from their peaks 10 to 15 years ago. You can also see it in this price convergence thing that I talked about earlier, where the price of a given good or service is increasingly kind of coming apart, which suggests that markets are less integrated now than they were a few years ago. So there's a question of kind of why is this happening? And there's lots of different explanations. I think China is the rise of China is a big one. What we're seeing at the moment, particularly in the US, is essentially a concern that China is becoming too dominant. Globalization was a system that benefited China enormously. It managed to lift 800 million people out of extreme poverty, which, whatever you think about the Chinese Communist Party, is truly an astonishing achievement. But the concern now is that China dominates in too many industries globally, particularly manufacturing industries. So the ones that people are really worried about right now are solar panels, and obviously in a world where we would like to move to cleaner energy, that's a big concern. People are also concerned about China's place in manufacturing in general, in fact. But the other big one now that people are kind of talking about is electric vehicles, where China is having is kind of developed a lead that's not yet unassailable, but is extremely dominant. It's able to produce, pretty good cars, electric cars, at a very, very cheap price. And so a lot of people, particularly those in Germany, but also in the US, are deeply concerned about this. One thing that I would keep an eye on, which doesn't get a lot of talk in the media at the moment, but I think will do in the coming years, is aviation, passenger aviation. China does have a passenger aviation company called Comac. You may not have heard much about it, but it's producing passenger jets that are about the same size as Boeing's and Airbus's. They are about as good, I think, judging by the online reviews on YouTube that I've watched and also conversations with experts. And they're also about the same price or even cheaper. So I wouldn't be surprised if people start to worry about that before long. And what that really is meaning is that a lot of governments are deciding that they want to retreat from globalization. They want to move to a world in which, rather than relying on foreigners to produce their goods and services, they want to produce more of them themselves. So you're seeing this in a big way in the US in particular, which is kind of leading this global charge. There's two big bits of legislation that everyone's talking about in the US. One is called the Inflation Reduction Act, and the other is the CHIPS Act. Now, the CHIPS Act, as you might imagine, is fairly self-explanatory. It's to do with chips. The idea is that China is also becoming too dominant in the production of chips, and that America's supply chain for chips is vulnerable to Chinese interference. And so the idea is for the government to give lots of money to chip companies. TSMC, which is a Taiwanese company, is the biggest one. Intel, which you will all have heard of, is another one. And the idea was to give them money to produce more of those chips in the US. So that's another one. Then the second big one, the Inflation Reduction Act, or the unfortunately named IRA, as it is called in the US, is really about trying to locate the production of clean energy in the US. So again, billions and billions of dollars available to companies and to households to basically try and get more of this done domestically. The US is spending the most, but it's not the only government that's spending a lot on this kind of thing. So the EU has its own plan to relocate production. The UK has one, although it's a bit less clear what exactly the plan is. And of course, we have a change of government coming. Australia has one, Canada has one. China, of course, still has one and has done for many years. India has got a very big plan that, again, doesn't get a huge amount of attention, but, for an extremely fast-growing economy, what's going on in India really matters to the rest of the world. So, worth keeping an eye on what's going on in India, because they're very keen on this idea of locating manufacturing in India. So what this all means really is that, governments are just less interested than they were in globalization. And so globalization's in retreat. We at The Economist think this is a pretty bad thing, generally, because globalization in the 90s and 2000s was not perfect in any way at all, but it actually gets a lot of unfair press, I think. Most notably when you think of global poverty. Global poverty really, really went down a long way in the 1990s and 2000s, largely because more and more countries were being brought into the global trading system. And so I think it's potentially a big problem that we're now moving away from that system. The question then, I suppose, becomes how much of a problem it is for the UK specifically. Now, this is speculative necessarily, but I think it's worth just remembering a few things about the UK. And I'm going to start with the kind of pessimistic case first. The UK has been, as you know, has been a trading nation really for hundreds of years, going back at least to the 30th and 14th centuries, when we were sending all of our wool to the continent to be processed into clothes. So it goes back a long way. The UK has done well during periods of global integration, and I think it did pretty well in the 1990s when globalization was really taking off. If we look back at what was happening in the 1990s, global growth was pretty strong, and British economic growth was pretty strong. Unemployment came down a long way. Real wages went up by quite a lot. GDP growth was also pretty good. And so I think there is reason to be concerned about the retreat of globalization for the UK economy. Indeed, if you look at what happened to the UK economy after 2008, the global financial crisis, which led to a kind of deglobalization of the financial system. It's really in 2008 that the UK's economic troubles began. The UK's GDP per capita hasn't really grown very much since 2008, which is really a shame and really something that the next government, whoever it may be, does need to think seriously about, very seriously about, because without GDP growth, we can't pay for all the things that we want to have in the UK. We can't pay for a well-funded NHS. We can't have a higher standard of living. And so I think it is a concern that that globalization is in retreat for the UK because the UK is so dependent on what's going on in foreign markets. Now, of course, Brexit plays a role here too, and I think the evidence is showing that Brexit is having a somewhat negative impact on the UK economy. I don't think it's as big as many people have thought it would be, but I'm having looked at the data quite a lot. I'm now kind of satisfied that there is a relatively minor but definitely apparent hit to what's going on in the UK economy. If you look, for example, at goods trading, I think that might be something that people watching this might be particularly interested in. The UK's goods exports have done very badly since 2020. Of course, the pandemic plays a role there too. The impact of China plays a role there too. But these figures are not good and they're worse than what's going on in other countries. It is also true, worth bearing in mind, that the UK's services exports have actually done pretty well over the past a few years. So it's not the case that the UK has completely retreated from the global trading system. That absolutely is not the case. But things have not gone as well on the trading front as we might have hoped. And so I think that's something to be concerned about. And I think the next government needs to think carefully about what it wants to do to try and boost the UK's trading position globally. I think, for example, having more of a closer formalized relationship with the EU would be one example of that, but I won't get into exactly what they might do. On the other hand, I think there is reason to be somewhat more optimistic about the UK. Certainly, than the market is kind of talking about the UK. UK assets are very underpriced, I think, at the moment. If you look at the pricing in the FTSE 100 compared with, say, the S&P 500, the Dow Jones in the US, UK assets do look very cheap, and I think that's really a result of it's kind of what you might call kind of bad vibes about the UK economy. I think when any government is in power for 14 years, bad vibes kind of inevitably develop. Brexit was also some seriously bad vibes for the UK. The pandemic didn't go very well in many regards for the UK, so that was also bad vibes. So I think these things do shift, and I think a change of government, or indeed just any new government following an election, could lead to a vibe shift. Hard to say for sure, and of course no one knows for sure, but I think that's possible. That's very possible, and you do see this in UK history where a change of government does lead to a sort of substantial improvement in the kind of economic mood of the country. I think it did happen in the late 1970s. I think the late 1970s. I think it did also happen in the mid to late 90s as well. So these things do happen, and I think in a couple of years we might look back on the period of kind of 2022 to 2024 and kind of wonder why everyone was quite so down on the UK. I don't think it's totally necessary, but I think there's kind of three other things that are going actually in the right direction for the UK and gives me somewhat more optimism than I think most people have. One is to do with house building. This is a big challenge for the UK. Housing is too expensive, and housing is actually really expensive by international standards. I think Labour is quite serious about boosting the number of houses. But the Conservatives too have also been serious about this. I think things are moving in the right direction. I think AI is going to be a big positive for the UK economy. After California, it's really the UK in second place, and the UK is really good for that. And the third is demographics. Yes, the UK faces a demographic transition like most rich countries, but actually it's in a relatively good position in that regard. The UK population is relatively young, so that does give me optimism too. So I'm going to end there, and my 15 minutes is nearly up, but some reason for optimism. And thank you very much indeed to Tim and to the SPEA as a whole for inviting me back to speak. It's been a few years since I spoke with you folks, but it's very nice to come back.